Yellowjackets has just released episode 4 of season 3, and following Coach Ben being found in the cave at the end of the 3rd episode, this one saw him return back to the camp and face trial for his accused attempted murder of burning down the cabin in front of Judge Natalie and jury Team Yellowjackets, with an ending that also provided a shock revelation in the present day with Lottie, and Shauna continuing to get on my nerves no matter what timeline we're in. Let's dive into the episode and break down all that there was to take away from it. Here is Yellowjackets Season 3, Episode 4, Ending Explained. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The trial of Coach Ben Scott. The trial of Coach Ben took up the core part of the episode, and I'm glad that it did, because it was definitely the most interesting element of this week's feature. We saw that Nat was the person that was the judge, Ty was representing the prosecution, and Misty was representing Ben as his representative for defense. And I'd say we saw that she did genuinely believe that he was innocent and that he didn't start the fire. He was on trial for the attempted murder of the group, and Shauna was the person that was leading the accusations towards him and stating that he needed to pay for what he did, even though there wasn't any evidence that proved that he did start the fire. And that's the biggest thing for me with the trial. It was over before it started because it was a case that had no evidence and was fueled with emotion and anger from the group. Like Ben said when he was locked up, he knew that his fate was sealed. For the most part, the group believed that Ben was responsible, and it was further supported when Ty pulled out the information of knowing that Nat was aware of where Coach Ben was, which caused even more division amongst the group and solidified their view that it had to have been Ben. But it was ultimately when Ben took to the stand and mentioned how much he cared for each of them when he was their coach, and how if he hadn't liked them, then he wouldn't have protected them in the past, where emotions were actually coming out from the girls. Something that did make me feel surprised when we saw the initial verdict of the sheer amount of people voting that Ben was guilty. The group couldn't reach a 2/3 majority, and it ultimately meant that they had to keep going over and over again, and this was done until there was a 2/3 majority. However, Shauna channeled anger, rage, and a darkness, and she pretty much started forcing everybody to vote guilty, and it ultimately meant that she got her way. What was interesting to see here was, 1, just how quickly people changed their mind, which I thought was a bit weak of them, and it kind of made the trial redundant. But also how the wilderness responded to Shauna's aggression, something that Lottie definitely noticed. This ultimately meant that Ben was found guilty and he'd now be set to face punishment. I'm still standing by the fact that it could have been Van or the evil side of Ty that did it. When looking back at the dream that Van had last week, in this episode, Akhila said that it was almost like a memory or a vision. So with Van seeing that very fire, it showed that she was connected to it in some way. She could have done it herself, or there is actually a theory going round that it was Ty that did it, and Van's protecting her. Van was actually emotional during Coach's speech, which made me feel quite shocked that her hand went up so quickly. So it does make me feel like her decision was made no matter what. Plus, when she raised her hand for the guilty verdict, she looked over at Ty, which definitely makes me think that there's more on the cards with this. Shauna. Does anyone else dislike Shauna at the moment? Whether it be the past or present, she's just doing my head in. She's on the offense all the time, and it makes her such an unlikable character. But first, let's start by discussing the Wilderness Timeline version. I think it definitely feels like Shauna's going to be leading an uprising. Even the way that Nat was slowly losing the outfit that she was wearing throughout the episode. By first taking off the crown, then the cloak, and then being sat on the stand that everybody else was. It was almost as if she was being stripped of her title in a visual, metaphorical way. A title that Shauna previously wanted, and it now looks like she's gonna get. Shauna pretty much forced the people around the table to raise their hands for the guilty verdict and made the entire trial redundant because it ended up just being her pushing people into doing what she wanted. This is something that I think will show 2 different ways of ruling. One which was Nat, which was a fairer way, and also Shauna's in being more of a dictatorship, as she didn't even want there to be a trial. However, once she managed to get the verdict over to the side of guilty, Melissa went over to her and told her that that was what true power felt like. A feeling that Shauna enjoyed having, and one that it looks like she's going to seek out by taking down Natalie and causing an element of division within the group. I also think with the influence of Lottie seeing the wilderness responding to Shauna's aggressive state, Lottie will look to support Shauna too, which will also make a wider difference. Within the present day, we saw that Shauna was looking to reverse her bad karma and assist Jeff in doing the same too. Oh, and as per usual, she was shouting at Misty and blaming her for things that she didn't even do, such as messing with her brakes and locking her in the freezer. Whilst Shauna was locked in the freezer, we saw that she had a vision of Jackie alongside her, and they were deep in conversation about the fact that Shauna would be able to get out of there and handle the things that were coming her way. But with her eventually getting out and finding out that it wasn't Misty that locked her in there because she'd been gone for hours, it made her realize that maybe she did need to start righting some of the wrongs that she'd done over the years. Hence why she went into the city and got a cat to fill in for the missing persons cat. I actually think that right down to Shauna's core, she's a selfish, narcissistic individual, and I actually thought she'd be the person that would end up dying in the present day. But seeing as though it was Lottie that kicked the bucket, I think Shauna's probably safe for the season. I thought the dynamic between Shauna and Misty was something that was at the heart of this episode too across both timelines. For example, we saw Shauna versus Misty in the wilderness, with Misty defending Ben and Shauna advocating for Ben to be punished. Plus, we saw Shauna versus Misty in the present timeline too. We saw that Misty walked away because she got so frustrated with Shauna to the point where she imagined killing her. But the funny thing is, Shauna presents herself differently and views herself as a higher person than Misty. But in reality, they're not actually that different deep down. And I feel we're going to see that developing more and more as the season goes on. Ty and Van and Lottie's death. After Van and Ty saw the coyote with a rabbit in its mouth in the previous episode and it being a sign that it wanted more, we saw that Ty was leading this hunt for it to decide who should be killed as a sacrifice as a way of enabling Van to be able to continue to live. We saw that with the waiter dying, it meant that Van wasn't getting any more sick, and there were signs of her recovering, and Ty believed that it was because a sacrifice was made, meaning a life for a life. They ultimately laid down a Queen of Hearts, and whoever got it would be the person that would be killed. With them following the man who picked up the card, who we heard was a father, Ty was actually willing to go inside of his apartment and quite literally kill him as an offering to the darkness. But it took Van being the one to say that she didn't want more time to come at the cost of other people's lives for it to not happen, even though Ty didn't really see it that way. This was pretty much all we got of Ty and Van in the modern day timeline until both of them were in New York City, a place where it felt like Lottie was earlier on in the episode. And we actually saw that Lottie ended up lying dead on the ground at the bottom of the stairs of where her baptism vision was in the first season of the show. I was shocked when it was revealed that Lottie was dead, but I wonder if this further sacrifice is going to be something that's going to enable Van's life to continue and be seen as a sacrifice. It looked like both Ty and Van were in the same city as what Lottie was earlier on in the episode. And also, it seemed like Shauna travelled there to get that cat. So I'm suspecting that there's definitely a connection between Lottie's death and the presence of Van, Ty and Shauna. It's almost going to be a bit like a whodunit, I imagine. My review of the episode. I thought the episode was alright. It wasn't great, but it was enjoyable to watch. I definitely think that the present day timeline is growing a bit stale and that the show is just now committed to giving us moments within it despite the fact that it's getting a bit boring. I feel like that's why they ended up killing Lottie, because they needed a way of keeping it exciting as the story wasn't really progressing. I'm definitely the most invested in the wilderness timeline, and I'd be happy to spend most of my time in that one, as that's where I think we get the stronger story, the darker events, and the characters feeling a bit more engaging and interesting. I'm already predicting Callie blaming Shauna for Lottie being dead because she threw her out, and that causing a deeper rift between the mother and daughter. Yeah. When it came to the trial in the wilderness timeline, I thought it was really interesting. However, I would say that it was extremely cringy, but I can look past that because to the girls living there, it is life or death, and their survival is something that's at the heart of it. I actually thought Ben's speech was one that was really sad and it evoked emotion out of me. Just seeing his face at the end where he was found guilty, there was no fight left in him. So it's going to be sad to see what might end up happening to him and this outcome that Travis spoke of coming into play. In saying that, there were 3 figures around a floating body, so what if that's connected to the present day timeline, and Lottie being dead and Ty, Van and Shauna all being in the city? One thing that I feel could be on the horizon is that Lottie looks like she's going to push Akhila into going back into the cave and experiencing those visions, something which might push her to breaking point. I thought the fact that she was holding a rabbit, the very thing that the coyote had in its mouth in the previous episode, showed that she might end up with the same fate as what that did. Being claimed by the wilderness. So if that's the case, then that was actually a good use of foreshadowing. The season definitely isn't the most exciting that it could potentially be at the moment, but I'm feeling like I'm definitely intrigued to see what's going to happen to Ben and also the uprising that Shauna looks like she's going to lead. So I'm holding out and I feel like there are good things on the horizon. So, There you have it, Yellowjackets Season 3 Episode 4 Ending Explained.